Welcome back. It is really a pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Stephen Satterfield. He's the founder and owner of Whetstone Media. Stephen will share his journey and the lessons learned in the years, I think, before and after his first wine epiphany more than 15 years ago here in Oregon. Stephen's accomplishments as a force for change, a sommelier, writer, editor, media creator, social entrepreneur, and self-described origin forager are inspiring, to say the least. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. But with that, allow me to introduce Stephen Satterfield.
Thank you. Thanks, David and Bridget, to Live, and everyone for having me. I think this is probably the most formal and organized conference that I've been a part of in the COVID era. So kudos to everyone who took part in organizing and hanging in there as attendees. So today, I think probably the best way to provide some context about what I'm going to talk about is to tell you who I am. So I'm going to give my story in chronological order, and then from there, hopefully be able to provide some key takeaways and some further context about the work that I do. So my work and my journey started in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I'm from. I was born to a very loving middle-class suburban family in Atlanta, and a family that really, our hallmark was the place of convening around food for other members of our family, not even for special occasions, but also just in sort of the archetypal Black tradition, just for Sunday dinners as well. And when I was in middle school, my mother, who is now a elementary school principal, but at the time was working as a high school counselor, she decided to take my sister and I to a private school in Atlanta called Westminster, which is and was one of the top schools in the Southeast. It is a school that would be enviable for anyone's academic aspirations, or if not the children, certainly the parents who send them there. And that became a really formidable and influential time in my life. It's the first time that I really began to grapple with matters of identity and belonging, things that at that time I didn't have language for. Growing up going to public schools with a very, very mixed group of friends, diverse group of friends from Cambodia, Russia, Jamaica, all over, into a school that was primarily white, very Christian, very straight, and very wealthy. So it was hard for me, I think probably goes without saying, although at the time I didn't really struggle to make friends. I had lots of friends, and I had a very easy time adapting to the environment for a couple reasons. The first of which is I was a really good athlete. So that's, when you're a young boy in middle school and high school, being good at sports can take you far. So I had that working for me. And I also really just wanted to fit in, even though I felt uncomfortable in the environment. The way that I dealt with the discomfort was simply to try to be likable. And it is something that I didn't consciously realize that I was practicing. But it was the only way that I was able to survive being so out of sorts and out of place as a young person. And by the time I turned 18, I was very ready to leave Atlanta. I was ready to leave that environment. And I came from from Atlanta to Oregon, to the University of Oregon. And this is in 2002. So this is before we were applying for college online. And I remember talking to my high school counselor, and when they're asking you your short list of places that you'd like to go, um, I wanted to visit Oregon simply because it was as far away as possible from Atlanta. And so that was really it. I looked at a brochure, um, and I noticed that Oregon was a place with a lot of trees, and great proximity to nature, both obviously, as you well know, the coast, the mountains, the desert, and it was pretty much as far away as possible from the environment that I was in. So I visited Oregon without ever having been to the West Coast at all. And it was an incredible choice and the right choice for me. Um, I had a really wonderful experience my freshman year at U of O. I kind of had a classic experience of partying a lot, making lots of friends, just kind of finding myself as a young person. Um, and I saw someone say, "Go Ducks." Uh, I I also at that time though realized that I wasn't going to be able to make it through college for many reasons, not the least of which was financial. I wasn't there on scholarship. But I also had decided at that point, I really loved food and had an affinity for food in such a way that made me want to dedicate my life to it. Um, and for a little bit of context, when I was in high school, one of the ways that I would kind of soothe myself, my favorite pastime, so to speak, was coming home and watching Food Network. So this is in the era of, early Emerald, Bobby Flay, uh, pre-problematic Mario Batali, and also on the public television. I was a big fan of Julia Child, Jacques Pepin, and had this enlightening moment of making a souffle for the first time that I first saw Julia Child make, and then eventually, after buying a cookbook, successfully made for myself. And from there on, really just found artistry and a connection to food that was more profound than I realized at the time. So after that first semester in college, I decided to stick with food, or to move towards food, I should say. And so I enrolled in the Western Culinary Institute. I'm not sure if it's still around, but this is the Le Cordon Bleu School in Portland. And that's really where my life kind of started to happen. Um, I don't know, maybe some of you all will know, but I had a teacher by the name of John Eliason. He was a garage winemaker for a winery called Labette. And he, as part of our curriculum for the hospitality school, was the one who gave us our introductory wine courses. And so from there, I immediately fell into wine as a language that I wanted to better understand. I did have, yeah, John is awesome. I did have some context with wine. Um, in that, in my high school, one of my very close friends, his father, was a major collector. And I remember going over to his house, and this is a man that I had great respect for and still do. He became a mentor of mine. And I just remember the seriousness with which he thought about wine. It wasn't, it felt less like a hobby and more like a language to be known and understood. And in fact, that's the relationship that, or the vocabulary that I still refer to wine as its own language. So from that experience, kind of getting reacquainted with wine in a more formal academic context, I really almost immediately decided that that was how I wanted to spend my life. And so with the kind of impetus and inspiration for John through John, I visited the Willamette Valley as a 19-year-old. The first winery I ever visited was Domaine Drouin, um, which, of course, this is a full circle moment for me now sharing this story with you all. But that was the first time that I really began to connect with wine as an agricultural product. And so from there, I started taking sommelier classes at the Heathman Hotel. I had some great mentors in the wine industry and eventually got a job at Genoa Restaurant as a manager in 2005. And a lot of you will know Genoa from back in those days, but it is and was such a singular and incredible experience to work there. Um, I learned so much, not only from working at Genoa, but also it was just such an important time in Portland, which is also to say such an important time in U.S. food culture, and many of the aesthetic ways in which we now define sort of contemporary U.S. cuisine, both in terms of its provenance, but also I think just stylistically, really emerged from Portland at that time, and it was really an incredible time for me to absorb, the energy of the early aughts and being in Portland. And from there, I managed at Genoa from 2005 to 2007, worked a lot in the wine program back when Genoa had hundreds of thousands of dollars and wine inventory. I tasted a lot. I learned a lot. But eventually, started to find myself in this familiar feeling of alone, and not seeing others like myself who were a part of this community, even though it was a community that I had a great deal of affinity for. And so I decided to move back to Atlanta in 2007. And it was sort of a somber move back home because I really didn't know if I would have a future in wine. I didn't see myself sort of continuing my education as a sommelier. But I knew that wine was a part of who I was. And so that was something that I was grappling with, and decided in 2007 that if I couldn't find my community here in the States, that I was actually going to go to Africa to try to build community there. So I started a nonprofit organization called the International Society of Africans in Wine. It's a mouthful, but the acronym was ISAW. And basically, through the research that I had been doing at the time, learning about the colonial history of wine in South Africa, that it was settled and colonized by the Dutch, that through enslavement, there is a thriving industry that, continued for hundreds of years without any equity to show for it. So after the apartheid ended, the South African government made some grants available to some Black vintners and really Black and Indigenous people throughout, a larger spectrum of the wine industry. And so I sort of hooked into some of those programs to learn how my role as a sommelier from the US could support the various challenges for winemakers in South Africa. So in 2008, I went to the Western Cape, to Stellenbosch. I met up with the sole Black family who owned their own land in 2008 who was still producing wine. I met up and befriended the first Black woman who was a winemaker in South Africa, Nitsiki Biela, and really kind of immersed myself in this struggle or this kind of quest for identity, both as a young Black sommelier, but also through some of the social challenges happening in the wine industry in South Africa. And so my role in that work was really about telling their stories, about kind of explaining and contextualizing really complex narrative around race and identity, wine exploitation, to US audiences for whom this was completely new, who had never really even known that Africa was a place where wine was grown or had a long history. And in that work, I really started to, for the first time, develop my skills as a storyteller and as a media creator, although I wasn't conscious of the fact that that's what I was doing at the time. I simply was trying to capture the nuance and the urgency of the incredible winemakers who we were working with. So I became sort of a de facto marketer on their behalf, helping to support their wines being exported into the US, and doing trade shows, tastings, the marketing hustle that we all know so well, setting up my table with my swag and literature, to talk about this very unique subset of the wine industry that was not well known, discussed, or understood at that time. So from 2008 really to 2010, I continued to travel back and forth through to South Africa. And because we were a nonprofit organization, we were a 501c3 nonprofit. This was before Kickstarter or other, crowdfunding campaigns. This was the very, very earliest stages of Facebook. So there were, and this is of course when the laws in the U.S. around the distribution of wine and selling wine online were so very different. So in many ways, I like to think that I was ahead of my time, but also really bumping up against the realities of the financial crisis of 2008. So we were able to survive from basically late '07 until 2010. And after that, I decided to get back in the wine industry by moving to California. I moved to the Bay Area and became a manager at a restaurant called Nopa, which was an incredible experience. Nopa at the time was the it restaurant in San Francisco. It was, and probably still is, the most impressive convergence of sort of volume and scale and quality that I had ever seen in a restaurant. We were on busy nights during the weekend, could do 600 covers, over 1,000 covers when you included brunch. It's a place that pretty much had people working in it around the clock on the weekends, through brunch and dinner service. Not only that, they were kind of in the tradition of not just the Bay Area, but of course Oregon as well, really building their reputation and their pedigree upon an adherence to supporting local agriculture, to supporting small scale farmers. So this is a culture that I learned well from my time at Genoa, and really attached onto in a major way as a lover of eating and drinking, but also through my skills as burgeoning skills as a storyteller, wanting to do the work of sharing that enthusiasm, but also sharing from a more practical sense why this was an important environmental and ecological point of pride for the restaurant. So while I was at Nopa, I started to kind of create a position for myself as a in-house PR person, for lack of better framing, creating media by going to small farms throughout the Bay Area, our purveyors, and really using all manner of documentation to bring those stories back into our restaurant. So we had a blog, but we were also doing film and audio before we really had fully adopted the language of podcasting. This is in like 2013. And I did that for a couple years. The owners of the restaurant were incredibly supportive. And it really gave me confidence as a narrator, as a storyteller, that this was something that I could do professionally. So after doing this for about 2 years, I think my bosses were also like wondering what the end game was for them. They were paying me full time with benefits to work from home and organize field trips, not only for our staff, but for the public as well. So for a couple years there, I had, I think, probably one of the best jobs in the country, just eating, drinking, and taking people basically to field trips around Northern California. So at some point they decided that as much as it was good for the restaurant, that it wasn't necessarily a sustainable or core part of their business. So they asked me, what do you need to make this happen for yourself professionally? And I said, well, I need to kind of build a brand around this idea, and I want to continue to focus on these stories of origin and provenance, but instead of just doing it in Northern California, I'd like to do so kind of all around the world. So they gave me $5,000. I hired a graphic designer and a brand strategist, both of whom were, it sounds fancy, but these are just friends of mine who were really smart in this work. And that's how we came up with Whetstone. Whetstone, both the brand identity and really the language that we use to talk about our work as it exists today were really created, in 2015. So once, we had this identity, we had this mission around telling stories based on places and points of origin. I came to Oaxaca, Mexico, which is where I am today. So apologies for the internet latency if it's a struggle on your end. But I came to Oaxaca for the first time in 2015 to study corn and to study mezcal for the first magazine. It would take me almost 2 years before I was able to produce the first magazine, Whetstone Volume 1. But after a couple failed crowdfunding campaigns in 2017 with just $7,000, half of which came from friends and family and strangers through a crowdfunding campaign. And the other $3,000 I put on a credit card. I printed 400 copies of the magazine, and we haven't looked back since. Basically, year over year, we've grown, and it's all been sort of enabled by people all over the world who really have aligned with our mission of origin. So this year we'll print 40,000 copies of Whetstone, and the only advertiser that we have is actually worker-owned Oregon company, Bob's Red Mill. So it's been an amazing ride with Whetstone. In addition to the print magazine, we also have podcasts that we produced with iHeartRadio. We've shot short films all over the world. We've shot sort of video dispatches from all over the world and worked with a team of hundreds of global creators in over 80 countries. So how this all relates to kind of the origin story, this is sort of the first half of my own story that I wanted to provide context for around some of the larger themes and messages for today. And the first is really about the notion and the language specifically of terroir. Terroir is a word that I learned as a teenager. It is a word that is kind of part of our insular language in the world of wine that lets the other know that we have some framework of understanding wine. So going back to this notion of language as a means of building and developing community. So with this framing of terroir, I began to investigate what it meant to um, explore or really know the origins or really explore the utility of terroir. So essentially, when we want to understand wine, we understand it by evaluating a series of inputs, both human and environmental, to reach a kind of agreed upon framework for quality, for purity, so to speak, and also as a way to have a point of achievement, something that we can all work towards in terms of a standard of quality. And so, terroir, which is now a word, or I now use the word origin sort of interchangeably, and is the word that we kind of built our entire media company upon, is really something that I've extrapolated in a social and cultural context. So, what it means to understand society, what it means to understand a culture through the framing of terroir is to understand where people come from, what inputs went into their own human stories, and what we can learn about one another just by first understanding where we've come from. And so, in the language of terroir, one of the things that I was able to come back to in this framing of understanding is that understanding is really a basis of empathy. And I know it sounds hokey, but essentially the trajectory for me is that it's not possible to understand. It's not possible to love something without understanding it, and it's not possible to really be empathetic towards something without a common understanding. And so, as I moved on in my career, I really have thought more about this, um, my experience, growing up as a Black person in white spaces, and really just this paradox of homogeneity, in which, as I started to explore the origins or the terroir of all kinds of institutions, whether it be academic institutions, religious institutions, wine institutions, um, I really began to see a commonality in the lack of diversity. In other words, and not seeing other people who looked like me, I began to really ask what the purpose or what the foundations of these institutions were. And so I think that, through this kind of research or through this framework, I really began to understand what I have coined a paradox of homogeneity, which is to say that when you are in an institution that lacks diversity, it's important to understand that these institutions were built to preclude diversity. So, in other words, diversity is not a byproduct; it is actually part of the initial point of exclusion. And going back to this framing of understanding, of course, homogenous environments preclude us from being able to understand one another. Without understanding other people, we cannot truly be empathetic towards those people. We cannot truly begin to see them in their full likeness and their full brilliance. And the paradox part of this is that basically the institutions become diminished. The institutions are not able to reach their full potential because they have not allowed a diversity of thought and ideas into whether it's this word institution that I'm using, or more casually what we call our communities. And so I really wanted to kind of share this framing with you today, and kind of the paradox of homogeneity, but also and thinking about the terroir of inequality and the terroir of inequity, because what we don't understand, we're not able to confront. And confront has, of course, connotations that bring upon discomfort. But really, when I think of the word confront, I think of it as a healthy confrontation, in that when we don't confront things that need to be looked at, then essentially we begin to either repress what is important for our own growth and survival. And I think this analogy really holds true for the viticulturalist in the group. Looking at soil health, looking at the health of the soil requires us to not just look at these systems, ecological systems, in isolation, but to really look at the full ecosystem, so that when there's one part of the ecosystem which is out of balance, which is not equitable, we then have to interrogate the entire system, so that we can then isolate what the origin of the problem is. And I think that from a cultural perspective, especially when you're in predominantly white spaces, as I have many very close friends who are white, and we have as friends had to have these conversations as a means of better understanding each other. And what I've learned in these conversations is that without our healthy confrontation, the feelings that emerge through repression are unresolved, and it manifests specifically in the way of guilt, um, because people who are very kind-hearted, good-natured, who want things to be equitable, feel that they have no means of achieving equality, even though we all want, or most of us want, to be in a world that is equitable. And so I have found that this immobilization, which manifests or is derivative of guilt, is really placing our culture in a really negative cycle of not being able to repair past harm that has been done. And so, in thinking about the wine community in particular, sort of my I guess, call to action for you all would be to really think about the reality that, particularly in the US, wine continues to be an overwhelmingly homogenous industry. It continues to be an overwhelmingly white community, particularly at the levels of ownership and management. And it is also a unique industry in that we sell our product, almost uniquely so, based on story, and based on romance. And I think that kind of embracing these narratives of provenance and terroir give us a language, give us a framework to talk about difficult conversations in a way that other industries or other products really can't achieve, because using narrative that is rooted on land and pleasure really isn't something that translates for, let's say, for instance, like a technology company. And so really looking at story and looking at terroir as a basis of understanding, as a basis of interrogation, as I have my entire career, I think gives us a really unique and powerful framing, not only in understanding, interpersonal relationships, understanding why is it that our communities are like this. Well, if we were to kind of methodically move to the point of origin, or move into the terroir of inequality in the wine industry, we can see that the exclusion of Black people from buying land, in Oregon in particular, I'm sure many of you know, was a state in which it was actually not legal to be Black in the state. So even though there was, no slavery, there were still exclusionary laws. There were lash laws that said, if you were a Black person in Oregon, you would be whipped every 6 months if you did not leave the borders of the state. To this day, Oregon is a state that is only 2% Black. And this is, of course, from a more intersectional framing, this is not just a Black and white story. This is a story that is, of course, relevant for our Native brothers and sisters as well. This is a story that is relevant for, our brown brothers and sisters who work the land, who are often in arrangements of labor out of necessity, but also just by nature of the framing of the relationships, are coming into relationships in spaces that we occupy without power. And as we are in the reality of a system and a society in which we have this racial caste, in which there is a clear, racially ruling or racially dominant class, it is the impetus is on the class or the group that holds the power to help be a part of the repair, and to proactively engage in repairing these systems. And so I really hope that, through this framing, you all can, if you have felt these feelings of guilt and of immobilization and wanting things to be better, first, I will invite you to just let that go, to remind you that that is not an emotion that will ever be of service to you, but also really using what you know about the ways in which we are so brilliant and analytical, and looking at wine quality and looking at our environmental ecosystems, and bringing the same level of interrogation into our social and interpersonal relationships with the same curiosity, the same urgency. And I am convinced that, the lessons will be just as revelatory and certainly just as important. And finding ways, as we're communicating the importance of terroir, what makes it distinct, what makes our regions distinct and unique, that we really look at these terroir-based stories, these origin stories, as a way to not just talk about the land, not just talk about the finished product, but to really talk about the kinds of communities that we're building with a proper respect for all parties who help make our communities vibrant, who help make our livelihoods possible, and also as a way to, out of our own self-preservation. And I'm including myself as a person who loves wine, who wants to see the industry continue to grow and thrive, out of a need to grow the industry, really look at how diversity can be central to new narratives in the wine industry, new possibilities around inclusion, which subsequently, of course, opens up new markets, new generations of drinkers, and again, a more vibrant industry. So I'm going to stop right there because I want to leave some time for questions. But I appreciate you all absorbing a message that may not be one that you're often confronted with, but it is coming from a place of love and deep care, and out of deep respect for the work that you all do. So thanks for your time. And yeah, I'll turn it back over for questions if there are any.
Stephen, thank you. In the note that I wrote in watching your work, but before having seen you talk just now, what I wrote was that what I love about your work is that you lay out truths and you let the audience sit with the truths. You're not, your goal is to be thought-provoking, but not prescriptive specifically, which I thought I started to understand better of all places, digging into things like your Instagram. I don't think of Instagram as a place for profound thoughts and real depth, but yours is pretty amazing. And now I understand. I saw Stephen. Now I
Exactly.
get, yeah, exactly. So there are just so many pieces that come together in that, and there's no mistaking what you're saying about historical and current inequities in food and wine cultures and broadly, um, and in media, and in putting together uh, a magazine and other properties to, with almost no budget. For people who maybe haven't seen your videos, I almost don't have a question. I'm just, appreciating the work. I think as people maybe get a chance to meet you today, if they haven't already, um, they're when they see the videos, your piece on Georgian wine and the way you bring together the place, the culture, the religion that surrounds it, the history, there's so many different things you're weaving together, and then doing that with tea in Ceylon, and maybe the only question I have is where next after Oaxaca? Sort of where does this journey keep going?
Well, thank you for saying that. We are going to release a textile project, which will be full of amazing stories later this year. And just to speak to that Georgia video in particular, and just to kind of belabor the point that this is not merely a black and white issue, so to speak, but really a shift in perspective. So the reason that I wanted to go to the Republic of Georgia was really to deepen our own narratives and our own understanding as part of the wine community more broadly, of which I still consider myself a part of. So, when we are cramming to pass tests as sommeliers, our charge is to memorize varieties, to memorize crews, to memorize all of this framing that has a very Eurocentric and Franco-centric point of view. Of course, I went to Le Cordon Bleu school, the same thing. We never learned about any other food culture. If you went to culinary school, you would literally just think that food was the provenance solely of France and nowhere else. And so, after spending time in the wine industry in Africa, I wanted to tell a different story about wine that wasn't a racialized story, but a story about origins, and actually asking, like, where did wine come from? It didn't
Right.
it didn't come from Bordeaux. It didn't come from Burgundy. Of course, this is where our conversations around it start. But I really wanted to explore the origins of viticulture, and it took me to some very very remote parts of the Republic of Georgia, where I was able to meet up with a winemaker named Georgie Natanadze, who is producing, to my knowledge, I haven't seen this disproven yet, the oldest fruit-bearing vine that is still producing wine. It was a 400-year-old grapevine in the forest of southern Georgia, sort of right on the border with Turkey. And his story around preservation, his deep pride and sense of identity as a winemaker and as a Georgian winemaker was just such a different story than I had ever heard told in the wine industry, and really goes back to this idea of making the industry, which is already global but is not inclusive, more of an opportunity to tell more nuanced and interesting stories, so that when we talk about natural wine, for instance, natural wine without the context of understanding thousands of years of making wine in Quevery in Georgia, is a conversation that lacks context, and it's also an opportunity to get people excited to be part of a centuries-long or really millennia-long tradition of viticulture and wine consumption.
It was interesting, despite the tradition there, that he seemed to be quite the free thinker, in terms of his approach to making individual wines, and it wasn't the same thing every year by any means.
Yeah, and that's I think we can learn a lot from Georgie, because there's definitely a lot of people that I met in Georgia, sort of his community, who are befuddled by his work. You know, he's a young guy in his 30s who is kind of traveling all the time, telling his story all the time. Very sort of forward-facing person in an industry or a community rather, which can be very guarded and insular. And you know that has not been without challenges for him. But I think what he is correctly identified is that that wine is a global marketplace, and there's a place for all of us in that story. And he's now, you know, among many of his peers in the region, outside of you know, where he is in southern Georgia, he's one of the top sellers. And this is all because, you know, he has been bold in telling his story and including his identity in his work without fear, without shame, and with great pride. And I think that that's something that we can all learn, from.
Last thought is that so much of the, you know, it's interesting to see these videos, and so much of it's just available. One can do a pretty big deep dive, but that doesn't offset the costs of what those trips cost, and the film quality is extraordinary in the various pieces. And so, how do you, as a you know, as you build, it's purposely named Whetstone Media, not just magazine. How do you access the resources that will help you to grow? Because that's probably a similar question that a lot of small landholders and winemakers would have as well.
Definitely. We have, well, I should say, not out of necessity, not by design, right? So we have found that it's best to build a business and a brand not around advertisers or third parties, but rather establishing a deep and profound connection with the people who will buy your product. And so for us, you know, we have a premium product. Our magazine is $100 for a print and digital subscription over 4 editions. It is not an inconsequential amount of money. We do have other products that are more affordable, that are digital, but we're asking for a big commitment. And I think that, you know, kind of the liberating part in the transparency and honesty of these stories is that you're going to lose a lot of people on the journey, but the people who stick with you will stick with you in ways that really kind of transcend normal producer or seller and consumer relationships. So that becomes those become your people who will keep you alive, support all of your new ventures, support you as you move through new vintages, new products, new releases. And I think that, you know, it puts you in a more liberated space of being able to make decisions as a business owner, because you don't feel beholden to suppliers, distributors, or what have you. You know, you can really build that trust and deepen your relationship with, you know, the people who are furthering your work.
By the way, in the chat, there are links to Whetstone Magazine, also to the video, and you are easily Googleable. There's a word there that I could get to. There is one question of sorts in the Q&A. Really, it's well, I'll just read it. I would love to incorporate more diversity into our viticulture team, mostly summer harvest interns, but often don't know where to reach out to find people that are interested. Any recommendations on that? I don't know if there's something that's occurred to you specifically. I think the industry is working on developing, you know, meaningful resources around opportunity.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure specifically, but I think that, you know, this is going to be a life's work that really will transcend and supersede all of our lifetime. We're talking about repair from systems that are centuries entrenched. And so I think that the inclination is to want to react, and say like, well, what can I do right now? But really, my orientation around this is more about a personal engagement. Is this actually something that your workers want? Is this actually the way for you to most meaningfully impact their lives? If the answer is no, then I think we have to investigate like who this is for. And the answer might be yes. I'm not sure, but I feel that's a really important point, is to, again, kind of going to the root, going to the terroir, like why are we in this interpersonal relationship that has facilitated an imbalance of power? So that would be my first comment. And then secondly, I think that it's always best to begin with the folks in your community who are not well heard from or well understood. To kind of borrow from the activists and organizing community, really looking at the most marginalized groups who are fighting for equity, who are fighting for justice, and starting with those organizations, and kind of understanding their needs and understanding their leadership structure, is really a great way to become a successful and impactful ally.
Wow. Well, thank you. In very
Thank you.
simply, thank you. Yeah, on behalf of everybody, just wonderful to have you. And oh wait, here's a question. One more that's just coming in on the wire. Can you see these questions, or should I read it out?
I can jump in there. Okay, from Rebecca. Do you think the current energy behind reparations discussion have potential to bring light the crisis of farm consolidation and lack of young farmers? Great question. I am extremely, as you probably can imagine, supportive of the reparations conversations that are happening right now. I think a word that you've heard me use repeatedly throughout the last hour is repair. Kind of the root word in reparations really takes account and analysis of how we got to this point of imbalance. I know that it's a controversial thing for a lot of people, but I think that in looking to build a more sustainable industry and a more inclusive industry, looking at the role of land, whether it be agricultural land or urban land, really does have to be part of the conversation, particularly when you consider the ways in which wealth has been built in the country. Wealth continues to and always has been built upon land that has been passed on and increasing in value from generation to generation. And for those of us who have not been able to be generational participants in this really core means of building wealth, I certainly think that the wine industry could benefit from looking at how reparations, the framing of reparations, the implementation of reparations could be brought into the industry. So I think that answers the question, but certainly if you look at words like, if you just Google redlining, I don't think it's really too hard to understand how the consolidation of wealth and who gets to participate in the building of wealth needs to be redressed through land in particular.
Okay, well, Stephen, thank you very much. Yeah, deeply appreciated.
Thank you.
And yeah, gosh, have a great day in Oaxaca.
Thank you. And if anyone wants to follow up, feel free to reach out. You can reach me at Stephen at Whetstone Magazine. You can see my name here with a PH. Happy to continue any of these discussions on a more personal level if that is an area of greater comfort. As you can tell, I'm deeply passionate about wine. I owe the wine industry and Oregon wine industry in particular to my life and my career, and I want to see it thrive. So however I can support, you'll always have an ally in me. So thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.